Good morning, everybody. Hello. I know I'm between you and the break, so I'll be brief and change the conversation a little bit. Some familiar faces in the room. Hello again. I'm going to try and change the presentation that you saw in Beijing a week ago and in Singapore, and I see some people here from Japan as well. So I'm going to try and change the conversation from what's been a technical discussion, I think, largely, an implementation-based discussion. I'm going to be talking about policy, governments, creating demand for standards. And I'll talk about some of the work we've been doing, specifically, as Richard said, in the EU. I'm sure you've seen this or something very similar to this. This is a map showing all of the government, or at least public sector, activity around the world. There's a tremendous amount. In fact, this was only produced, I think, by CETA in Ireland about 3-4 months ago, something like that. And it's actually out of date. Already, there's a lot more activity going on in Latin America. I was over in Beijing and Singapore last week, and there's certainly some changes on the Asia side of the map as well. So I'm going to be talking about what governments are doing to provide clarity, leadership, and direction for the construction sector as a whole, using that public sector procurement power to drive and encourage, yes, the use of open standards, but also to encourage the digitalization of the construction sector. So that's going to be my theme, and specifically I'm going to give it a European context and talk about the work we've been doing to create an EU BIM task group. Just to follow on from Richard's lead, we also created a handbook which I'm going to cover off in more detail. So the starting point for our journey was about 3-4 years ago when the UK and Norway got together. Anybody here from Norway? This isn't kind of comedy act time or anything like that, but okay, good to know. So Starts Big for you, I'm sure you're aware of. Hello, and Irvin Root in the building regulators body. We got together and said, well, we're doing some things here in the UK, we're doing some things here in Norway. It looks like other countries could be interested in getting together. So let's bring together a meeting in Brussels. We picked Brussels as a relatively neutral turf to get together, and still is. And that was very successful. Within about a year, we recognized that we had an opportunity to collaborate and to align. We've got, since then, a lot of movement in Europe from Germany, Finland. These aren't all of them, but just some of the national BIM programs that have been started. But we recognized there was a risk, there was a challenge potentially, that if we are all just doing our own thing in our own particular world, that we could diverge and we could actually conflict with each other. We may create barriers to trade, to barriers to having contractors working in Spain and France and the UK and in the Nordic countries. So we wanted to recognize this. There was a starting point for why we would come together. Our solution for that, which took a couple of years to figure out, was that we would write a handbook and we would write a common definition for what we saw as a way to introduce BIM into public policy, into public procurement, but also describe it and define it at the technical level, at the implementation level, so the project level and the organization level. So it's doing a couple of things. And I'm going to spend a bit of time now sharing with you what is in that handbook, but use the handbook models to describe the EU work as well. So the EU handbook describes, first of all, a strategy model. This is a model that works, and we've developed this from the European activity, working with a lot of different countries, working with countries outside of Europe as well. And it's a way of defining a very impactful way to build a strong and robust national policy to encourage BIM, and specifically to encourage the digitalization of the construction sector. And it relies on these 4 themes. Building, first of all, a foundation of public leadership, understanding why you're trying to do this. What's your vision? Where are you trying to go? What are your goals? What are you trying to do from the public client perspective specifically to change the private sector activity and behaviours. Then we have communication, very important as part of any change program, of course, that you communicate. Why are we doing this? Again and again and again. We spent a lot of time on this particular point in the UK. Thirdly, building a collaborative framework. I'm going to draw a parallel here between what is being presented to you today at an organisational level or a supply chain level is equally appropriate at a national level. We want to not reinvent the wheel. We want to have one definition. We want to have one language which specifies this process and this thing we call BIM. And that's a very important thing because it changes legal frameworks as well as some of the technical things that we've been discussing in the past two presentations. And lastly, the whole reason for doing this, the only reason for doing this, is to build capacity. It's to drive a change in the industry. And I want to say industry, I mean that word both equally to the clients and to the industry private sector as well. So this is a model we've used. I'm going to touch on that, and I'm going to use that as a framework to describe to you the EU BIM task group and its work. There is also another level. So this is then the implementation level. So you've got to hold these two things in mind. We've got a strategic model. We've also got a definition model for how we do projects, but how we work in organizations on BIM, and it relies on these areas. And I'll touch on these later on. So, public leadership. The group that we run, that we have, is comprised of 23 countries now. It started off with the UK and Norway, thinking might be good to get together. We got, I think, about 7 or 8 countries first of all, and it's built up progressively over time. These are primarily public officials, so policymakers, public procurers, infrastructure owners, or building owners. In fact, we've got a really good mix. One thing I'm really pleased to see is we have about half of the group are on the infrastructure side of the house in terms of building linear infrastructure, roads and railways and water features and bridges and that sort of thing, which is very good to see. So the group itself, first of all, created a shared vision. What are we trying to achieve as a group? Why are we here? Why we had that existential kind of moment of, okay, this is turning into a great conversation. We're sharing experiences with each other. But what do we want to do? Where are we trying to go? And so we defined it in these 4 ways. I won't read this all out, but essentially it was to drive, ultimately, better value for public money. Unashamedly, it is a public sector client group that wants to see a tangible outcome on behalf of the public sector. Yes, of course, it wants to drive these other things as well, such as an open and competitive construction market, one that's fair, innovative, that's able to grow and trade across countries, not just domestically. One of the interesting things about this program was how we gained support and sponsorship from different levels. So first of all, within Startsbig, for example, and their support. And then it progressed through different levels. So then we had the European Commission conversation to say, we're on a journey here. We believe that this is a very important agenda for Europe, the digitalization of the construction sector. It's a very important sector. So we had these conversations. Not all of them were very welcome initially, or understood. Maybe that's a better word. But then over time, they understood that actually this was a really important agenda for Europe to get behind. So the European Commission actually fund our group and has funded it for the past 2 years and have extended that funding for a further year as well. We also have support from the home nations. So we have, out of our 23 countries, 17 of those have written a letter from a minister from the relevant ministry that's represented in the group to us, to me, to say we want to be part of this. We believe this is a very important agenda for Europe, but also for our country to be involved with. We all have a common goal in terms of building initially some understanding, just to get to a conversation where we agree across these different countries what BIM is in context of the public sector. We have a strategy to do it, so as I mentioned, build a group, evaluate pull together that expertise with a view to creating a single definition for what BIM is. The practicality of that, breaking that down, is to do, we did a survey, which took us about 3-4 months to do in the summer of last year. We then developed a handbook which drew on all of the different working groups of our EU BIM task group, which ended up with which is what I'm going to talk through now in a moment. Ultimately, we're trying to drive capacity in the public client. This is primarily driven towards the public client. We agreed, this was our first meeting, so when we first got together in Brussels, we spent a lot of time in workshops just trying to agree what it is we want from BIM as public sector clients. What are the outcomes we're focused on? So we put it into these 3 categories. Economic, we want to create some savings. We want to get more built for the same amount of money. Environmental, we want to have a better energy performance, use of our natural resources, reduce carbon and other things. And social, we want to create an environment where skills are becoming more digital in the construction sector, where we're upskilling the sector, creating new jobs. The European construction sector is a very large market, as I'm sure you're aware. It's about 1.2 trillion euros that employs about 18 million people. So it's a very important sector, and we recognise that if we could make even some savings, if we made 1% savings, that's one and a bit billion euros, pounds, euros, same thing, roughly these days. So we thought, we looked at what reports were out there. Now, this was a report from the Boston Consulting Group, which is a management consultancy much like PwC or McKinsey. And they estimated the potential for savings of digitalization of the construction sector globally by 2025 was between 13 to 21%, just in the capital phase, 13 to 21%. In the operations and maintenance phase, it's slightly lower. I think the upper figure was about 17%. So we thought, well, even 10% saving, if we could achieve that, then that would be about 120 billion pounds, euros. So clearly a significant and worthwhile activity. And this is why the European Commission are also supporting this group. I won't go into the detail too much of how we're organised, but essentially we have a structure, we have a contract from the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the one that I'm part of, and we have a contract with the European Commission to deliver this as a 2-year programme. We're continuing that over the next year as well to go further, and I'll describe what we're doing next. As I mentioned, these are the primary participants in our group: public policy officials, infrastructure owners, and public procurers. The way we're organised is to have the people with the yellow balloons over their head, as it was described at the last event, means this is not their birthday, but it means that they are part of the steering committee, which help to give diverse representation from large economies, small economies, countries in the south, countries in the north, east and west of Europe, and there are a few other differentiating factors as well. But we managed to do that with about 8-10 different people, and they drive the focus of the task group itself, and have driven the handbook development specifically. We have work group leaders as well, very much how you're organised in buildingSMART. For areas of focus along the bottom, the 3 areas of focus there, specifically legal, technical, and skills, people development. We've done some of this. So this, again, is the framework we use for developing national BIM programs or organisation-level BIM programs, or in this case, a European-wide program. And this is, on the left-hand side of that diamond shape, is about communication, engaging with industry and clients. We've done some of this. I won't pretend we're all the way there, but we've started to do awareness events such as this one. We attend events in Brussels with national and international standards bodies and member associations, professional associations, and so on. And we also do press and media and that sort of thing. But again, this is an important part of any national programme, and we've seen this happen in UK, France, a great example as well of of really engaging the community, really engaging industry with lots of different activities that are all aligned. I think the focus for you, perhaps, for this conversation is more about what we did next. So we wanted to signpost to public procurers. We aren't a competing body with buildingSMART. I'm going to preempt. I've done similar events, but and the first question is, how do you compete with buildingSMART? I want to make really clear and preempt the question. We don't compete with buildingSMART. We are here to encourage the use of open standards and ultimately to signpost to primarily public procurers, but everybody as well, that BIM can be understood in these four distinct areas, and encourage a common and consistent terminology. So that consistent terminology includes, for example, on the legal side, and things that I saw a moment ago from the presentation was around EIRs, Employers Information Requirements. It's about having clients specify what they want rather than just asking for, we just want BIM. Just do BIM, because we've heard it's really good. Do it now. So we've got clarity on the fact it's actually a bit more than that. You've got to specify that in terms of an information requirement. So it creates the potential for functions, an information manager role, often thought of as a specific job or somebody you need to hire. No, it's a function that could be shared across different roles. Intellectual property and treatment of that, liability and limitations of information, giving information purpose and clarity about how it can be used is a way to ensure that there are fewer claims and misunderstandings. I think this is your territory, specifically around how to deliver the capital phase of the project is where this primarily focuses. This handbook largely focuses. It has references and aspirations towards more on the operations side, but I think it is more capital delivery. It leans quite heavily on, if you're familiar with it, which I suspect you are, the ISO work, the 19650, which is an elevation or abstraction from some of the work done in the UK on the 1192 Part 2. It also introduces the idea of having an open data exchange, working in a container-based way, and also working with a common data environment. So what we're trying to do is give clear and concise terminology that can be used and repeated in contracts. It won't be perfect. I think a phrase that was just used, it won't be perfect, and I don't think any of us are pretending that it is, but it's hopefully a positive start in the right direction. And it also references skills development, specifically how clients can upskill as well. So that's about as far as we've got in terms of building capacity. I mentioned the diamond shape, which is at the top of it. We're just trying to drive and increase capacity, both within the client organizations and within industry. And this is as far as we have got at the end of 2017. It's been a 2-year exercise formally under the Commission's auspice, under their guidance and so on, and support, financial support. We've brought together 23 countries now. We've got in the room at any one time up to 15 languages. When we have seminars and discussions like this, we had, the last one we had in Brussels, we had 7 translators, all with our earphones on. So it's a really interesting idea that we're able to bring together different cultures, different ways of working, different legal structures, and different actual languages in a way to create this alignment around principles. And the point I'd leave you with here is around that 2 ideas of one at a strategic level of how you go about this. It can go across different levels, and secondly, at the implementation level. So what's next? We've just been confirmed to go into our second phase by the European Commission. So the ambition there, put simply, is to expand and increase the communication activity that we've done, the public leadership work that we have been doing with individual member states and ministries, and also to build out the framework. Ultimately, what that comes down to is going to be something really practical, like in phase 2, providing training. So the Commission are about to, I believe, issue out a training call, and also communications activities, PR activities, marketing activities to drive the message towards the media and to events and so on. I really believe that we have a really interesting group here and a really interesting thought activity going on in Europe, which is bringing public leadership together, understanding how this can affect and drive change not only in Europe but around the world. It's certainly driving national activities, certainly in Europe and elsewhere. And I see that from your perspective, I see that it very much creates demand for standards, and I hope this will be a useful activity for you in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Questions for Adam?
Will the second phase address the regulatory environment? We've seen very little progress across Europe in the digitization of regulation, and it's a major role that seems missing in the first stage.
Okay, so just as a bit of context for everyone, so on the legislative side on regulation, this was actually one of the starting points for this was the Public Procurement Directive, which I don't know, Nick, if you're familiar with. So the way the EU works, it's got a directive which goes to all public procurers across all member states and EEA members as well, which basically, and in there, requires or encourages, doesn't require, it encourages the use of BIM to be specified in public contracts. Now, there's a lack of clarity about what that is, which is one of the reasons why this group, just providing a bit of context to your answer, to your question, which is why this group partly got together as well, was to help give clarity to public procurers that were responding to the directive but didn't know how. So that's one point. I think on the regulation side, it's one of the things which we've been discussing is what would be a sensible goal or ambition over the next 5 to 10 years for this group and for the member states. So rather than, I'm not deflecting your question entirely, but I'm kind of just answering it by saying, what is it we're trying to achieve? And then we'll work out whether regulatory changes need to be made. So we're in this phase right now where we're looking beyond our phase 2, which is 2018, the immediate year in front of us, and saying, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve, for example, 10% of European public procurement to be requiring and introducing the framework that we have set out here into their contracts? If so, would there need to be some regulatory changes to support that change, potentially on the legal side as well? So it's an unknown thing at this stage. We haven't defined anything that we're going to change on the regulation side. I know there are things going on with EPBD, which is the Energy for Buildings Performance Directive, and I think they've also looking at some changes there to encourage exchange of BIM models specifically. Does that help?
Question from Richard.
Yeah.
Well, not so much a question as I'd like to comment on this. I think clearly there is, I think, a huge amount of alignment between the agendas and the ambition, if you like, that we have in Building Smart and driving forward as the Open BIM agenda. I think having strong, aligned client leadership is a key driver for that. I have, of course, had the benefit of looking at this report, and I have some material, if there's time, I'll share with you today, showing where I think there are lots of examples of how the work we're doing in Building Smart is absolutely coherent and aligned with this work. So I think actually what I really want to ask Matthew, Adam, is that we look for stronger, tighter relationships between Building Smart and your work, because I think it's a great opportunity for all of us.
Yeah, and I think in the phase 2, as I mentioned earlier, what we're now doing, we obviously consulted with industry. We've done a lot of work with our public procurers and public bodies to date to try and get our understanding and clarity up in terms of what we want as outcomes. And I think now is absolutely the right time to engage in that broader conversation in 2018. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.